Okay, motherfuckers, I'm gonna tell you, of course, that this what chicken house, that we are in wall files, we are in Rodeos, of course, that that's what chicken have, and everyone is trying to hurt the ball, of course, that that's what chicken have, of course, that that's what chicken have, that they want to put the ball in jail, of course. That is what chicken have, of course. That is what chicken have. That they try, but they can't, of course. That is what chicken have, of course. You won't make you can't. That is what chicken have. That you can't with me. That is what chicken have. That they don't wanna put you in jail, motherfucker. They hurt the whole time suiciding to get my money, to get my honey. Of course, that is what chicken have. The only ones who really deserve to be right here are the Jews and the communists. The Jews because they don't ask for money who isn't his or hers, that is what she can have. And the communists because they don't break the states, of course, that is what she can have. That the Jews don't ask for money who isn't his or hers, of course, that is what she can have. And the communists too, because they don't break the states, of course. You're the whole time making loans to the states and they cannot pay back, and they are gonna be slaves of you because you're gonna take the decisions for them. Of course, that is what you can have, that you're breaking the states, you're making the states go broke with the loans and we cannot take our own decisions. Of course, that is what you can have, that is what you want. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have. The only thing we want is market intervention and invest and increase our own money with state development so we can go broke. Because if the states don't have representation with the state, the people cannot ask for his rights. That is what she can have. We need the state to ask for our rights, of course. To don't be slaves of the enterprises, of course. That is what she can have, that we need strong states, and for that we need market intervention and state development. That is what she can have, state-owned companies and things like this. Of course, the only ones who really deserve to be here, right, is the Jews and the communists. The Jews because they don't ask for money who isn't his, and the communists because they don't break states. That is what she can have. Of course, but with that I don't wanna say that you have to kill Ukrainians and Palestinians, motherfucker. Don't make me be misunderstood. I don't want to kill Ukrainians and Palestinians, but I am asking why is everything the other way? Of course, where is the thing? Backwards, of course. That is with chicken and why, and you know that, so come on. Of course, I ask you why is the people suiciding to get money who isn't his or hers? Of course, why is the people asking for pills Wilson from them? That is where chicken have. I don't have swans on my account. That is where chicken have, that they have the whole bitches counting and washing. That is where chicken have, and I don't have swans on my account, of course. But why is people asking for money who's in his or hers? Of course, that is where chicken have, and you know that, so come on. Of course, that is where chicken have, that your money is your money and from no one else. That is where chicken have. It's DNA, of course, that is where chicken have, and so it has to be. That is where chicken have, and you have the whole time people taking lives from communists, of course, only because you are a left student. You don't have right for your life, and you say that your son is son from God, and that you don't have any right over him, and things like those. Of course, that is what chicken have, that everything is crazy. That is what chicken have. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what chicken have, that you're the whole time doing what you shouldn't. That is what chicken have, that is what you're doing. So come on, they're kidnapping kids from communist fathers all around the world and eating just because you throw rats and lambs at them. Of course, that is what you can have. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, that is what you can have. That I have many people residing around me to get my honey, to get my money. Of course, that is what you can have. Yes, and so it is. Of course, as we say to get my honey and say that I'm only just there for Judas or things like those. Of course, that is what you can have. That I have my checks, that I have my DNA, that everyone knows it's my money, and everyone knows that you fell in love with naked on suicide to get my money. That is what you can have. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have. That so isn't life. Of course, if you want a life, have a fuck, motherfucker. Of course, that is what you can have. That if you want a life, you have to start with the Kama Sutra instead of the Bible. That is what you can have. So it is. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have. Don't save no one because you're gonna think going. You have something of your own. You also just go. Of course, we're in a rodeo. Of course, that is what you can have. That the only ones who deserve to be with me are the Jews because they don't ask for money, who isn't his or hers, and the communists because they don't break the states with laws and they don't make the people lose his representation in the state and their representation to don't be slaves of the enterprises and things like that. Of course, that is what you can have. That don't kill Palestinians and Ukrainians, man. If I'm not telling you that, so go on.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, that is what you can have. To train Rodeos and bullfights. You want my ear, you can't. That is what you can have. That you know that, of course, that they just don't ask for money, who's on his or hers. Of course, they don't beg. That is what you can have. That you'll beg for my money, and I had enough. Of course, that is what you can have. If you want money, you read the Kama Sutra instead of the Bible and have a fucking have your life. That is what you can have. So it has to be. I'm not gonna give a cent to anyone. That is what you can have. So go on. Of course, that is what you can say. That no one can against me. That you're all the time talking about freedom, but the freedom of the enterprise is to save the workers without any control of the state. Of course, and I had enough. Of course. That is what you can have. That I'm in a rodeo, of course. That is what you can have, and I'm gonna steal the whole money. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on. That is what you can have. That you're in a rodeo tiger. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. So what are you gonna say? Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against me and that I'm gonna stay fine. Of course, that is what you can have. That they just don't ask for money, who is in his or hers, and the communists don't break the states. Of course, why is everything backwards? Of course, that is what you can have. That I don't want to kill Ukrainians and Palestinians, but everything is backwards because they just don't beg and ask for money, who is in his or hers. Of course. And the communists don't break states, of course, but don't kill Ukrainians and Palestinians. Of course, peace, motherfucker, that is what you can have. So go on.